Good evening. Thank you so much for showing up to this seminar. As the only Italian on the panel, I find your idea of a seminar starting on time a bit obscene. Since this is a seminar on Bruno Leoni, and as my very distinguished co-panelists will tell you, Leoni is about spontaneously evolved law, it's about mores, it's about customs, it's about habits, and how really institutions are molded by time and evolution. I will go for the local mores, and we will start indeed on time. I am Alberto Mingardi. I am a founder and director general of Istituto Bruno Leoni. Bruno Leoni is our official patron saint. Our institute was established in 2003. It was kind of an extremely bold experiment. It was a free market think tank in Italy. And it was bold in two ways. It was bold because it was free market and in Italy, obviously, but it was also bold because it was a think tank. And my own country has a very, very small tradition in independent think tanks. I mean, typically, for many years, we outsourced the production of ideas for politics to politicians. And that may be why our GDP debt ratio is 136.2% now. Istituto Bruno Leoni doesn't deal exclusively with the thought and the works and the writings of Bruno Leoni. We're a policy think tank, like a smaller version of something like the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. But clearly, one part of our activity is also education. We need to do policy and education at the time because in our country we enjoy the beautiful position of holding the monopoly of competition. The monopoly of ideas in favor of free markets and competition. And among the things we do in our educational activities, there is the promotion of the works and the writings of Bruno Leoni. I'm very grateful to the Antonin Scalia Law School for hosting this discussion. Very grateful to the Liberty Fund in Indianapolis for helping us in putting together a series of conferences here and later on in Guatemala and in England and before this conference in Italy will help in, perhaps shedding new lights on the works of Bruno Leoni in the 50th anniversary of his extremely untimely death. Leoni, to give you just a few data about him, was born in 1913. He was born in the city of Ancona on the Adriatic Sea for no particular reason. His mother was from Südtirol, so basically German. His father was from Sardinia, but they were on vacation over there, and Leoni was born in Ancona. And then he moved very soon to the city of Turin. He studied in Turin under Gioele Solari, perhaps the most relevant legal thinker of the age. He was made a temporary professor, so he started his academic career in 1942 at the University of Pavia, but he needed to stop, clearly because of the war. He fought for 1 year with the Italian army, and then he defected to the Allies, and he was a member of a secret organization whose job was basically helping prisoners of war to escape from Italy. And in that capacity, he saved something like 150 British soldiers. After the war, Leoni was a very important man in the Italian cultural environment. He was professor of legal theory. He was the dean of the political science department in Pavia. He was active in the international freedom movement. He was secretary and very briefly president of the Montpellier Society. He was a journalist. He continuously contributed op-eds to the popular press. He was a political activist for the Italian Liberal Party. He was a lawyer. He did many, many things in his very short life because he died, unfortunately, age 54 in 1960. 7. Leoni was described by one of his students as a continuous eruption of energy. And this may explain why he was able to, keep on doing so many different things, keep on so many different efforts in his own lifetime. He wrote a lot. His collected works that my institute is publishing in e-book form will count 11 volumes, but most of his writings were scattered pieces, lecture notes, articles, op-eds. I think because he never quite had the time to sit down and compose a systematic book on the subject he holds dear the most. When I think of the sort of life he had, of the sort of things he did, I'm always kind of surprised he actually had time to get married and even produce a daughter. The reason why, when we established our institute, we picked Bruno Leoni as our patron saint, I think will be evident in our discussion. Leoni was a radical libertarian, really a strange bird in the Italian political and cultural environment at the time. And his most famous book, his Freedom and the Law, was published in 1961 in English, oddly enough. The book in itself is the output of Leoni's lectures in a seminar in which other lecturers were Friedrich von Hayek, who presented a version of the Constitution of Liberty, and Milton Friedman, who presented a version of Capitalism and Freedom. So I think you can picture what kind of seminar that was. Not really your regular one. Freedom and the Law is an important book. Leoni himself never translated it into Italian because he thought that at that time was kind of wasting his own time. The political tides in Italy were going in the opposite direction, pretty much so. But it was Leoni's own contribution to an understanding of law that was, profoundly in depth with the Austrian School of Economics. So the whole book is predicated upon a comparison between legislation on the one hand and central planning, and on the other hand of the market process and the common law. These, as we repeatedly talked about before in another roundtable, in another discussion, doesn't necessarily mean that Leoni was going for judge-made or judge-discovered law no matter what. But it means that Leoni tried, to look at the evolution of norms, to look at a spontaneously evolved kind of law as a good guarantee for liberty in our classical liberal sense of negative liberty against the intrusion of ever-growing interventionism, which he believed was possible only in a system that was based on legislation. Leoni has many interesting claims in Freedom and the Law, but there are a couple I'd like to mention. One is a distinction, an analytical distinction Leoni makes when it comes to legal certainty. Legal certainty is typically equated, with statutes, with laws being written and being in a court where people can go and read them. Leoni distinguishes instead between a long-term and a short-term version of legal certainty. Short-term, you got certainty when you can access the law and read them and understand them, but in the long term, you need some sort of process that makes, arbitrary changes in the law more difficult. The second contribution I'd like to mention is the twist Leoni does on, famous distinction. It goes back to Aristotle. Government by laws and government by men. And one thing Leoni points out is that in our time we are governed by men precisely because we are governed by laws. So lawmaking in the sort of abstract, generally applicable form that was aided, for example, by Hayek as a sufficient guarantee against arbitrary interventionism was not such a sufficient guarantee for Leoni. And it was not because he thought basically lawmaking entrusted in parliament with majority rule was, once again, a way in which men, arbitrary power, were getting the better out of our daily lives and our economic lives too. Freedom and the Law is a book that has become, I would say, a classic in the libertarian movement worldwide. We very often mention the fact that Freedom and the Law influenced at least one key reader, Hayek, who changed his own approach to law and legislation in his subsequent trilogy, Law, Legislation, and Liberty. But actually, Freedom and the Law has influenced many other writers and commentators. Hernando de Soto, in his work, is making reference to Bruno Leoni. And of course, Leoni was not really a law and economist in your standard sense. But you can argue that Leoni somehow indicated to his fellow scholar that you could use the toolkit of economic science to look at the law and analyze it. That's a very important function that he performed quite a few years ago, and that's the reason why Leoni is often quoted and mentioned by people like Richard Posner or Guido Calabresi that do not necessarily share Leoni's own normative libertarian philosophy. It's a great privilege for me to be playing the traffic lights, basically, in this panel discussion with three extremely distinguished scholars. Professor Todd Zywicki, that doesn't need any introduction in this room and to this audience. Professor Mario Rizzo, who teaches economics at NYU, and he's also the co-director of the Classical Liberal Institute in New York. And Dr. Chris DeMuth, who's Distinguished Fellow at the Hudson Institute, and he was for many years President of the American Enterprise Institute, and is a very accomplished and perceptive writer on matters of law and regulation. I would like to give the floor to Todd to kick off our panel discussion.
Thanks, Alberto, and I'm going to stand because I get too wound up to sit when I talk about exciting things like Bruno Leoni. So we've gathered here today. This is a conclusion of a conference that we had on Bruno Leoni and the administrative state. And that's what I want to focus on because, as Alberto said, the fundamental dichotomy that we see in Leoni is between sort of common law, judge-made law on one hand, and legislation on the other. It's since 1960 or so when he's writing. At that point, the administrative state is starting to grow, but of course in the last 50 years is when it's really exploded, right? This is coming out of the New Deal, and the inherent tensions in the administrative state are planted, the seeds are planted, but they haven't flourished into the dysfunctions that we eventually saw in the 60s and 70s, and the continued growth and growth and growth and growth of the administrative state. As law professor Gary Lawson once called it, the rise and rise of the administrative state, right? That it seems to grow and grow and grow and grow. And in many ways, what we see in the administrative state and the growth of bureaucratic governance over our lives is really legislation on steroids, which is that all the dysfunctions we see in the legislative process are magnified and reinforced in the bureaucratic administrative state process in many ways. In many ways, that's the apotheosis of that tension. And so I think we could put bureaucracy and administrative state on the side of the scale with legislation and talk about sort of where we are with respect to that. Now, Leoni himself, the cornerstone of his argument is that for freedom and the free society to be maintained, it requires a certain understanding of the nature of law and the legal process. And so, as a first approximation, when we distinguish between common law and legislation, and again, when I talk about legislation, I'm implicitly including the administrative state as part of that, it's important to understand when he talks about common law, judge-made law, he's not talking about it the way that we tend to think about it today in the post-legal realist, post-legal positivist world, which is what he is talking about is a spontaneous order notion of law. And what does he mean by that? Basically what it is it contrasts the idea that judges make law, or that judges are central planners who should design law, much like a legislature does. Leoni is saying that judges should try to discover the law. They should try to understand the law and the imminent norms and the expectations of people in society. So Alberto mentioned, for example, Leoni's profound influence on Hayek, which is, for those in the room who have read your Hayek, 1960 he comes out with Constitutional Liberty, which is right about the same time that Leoni comes out with Freedom and the Law. The vision of the rule of law and constitutional liberty is very similar to Hayek's vision of law in The Road to Serfdom. It's a very formalistic, what they call the Rechtsstaat process, which is basically formal limitations on government, rules announced in advance, and the like. By the 1970s, when Hayek writes Law, Legislation, and Liberty, as Alberto mentioned, the spontaneous order notion of law comes front and center in Hayek and Law, Legislation, and Liberty. And I think that that's under Leoni's influence, and it's also working out some of the tensions, and we could talk about this if you want to in the questions, working out some of the tensions and the critiques that we see of the constitutional liberty as it arises there. And what do they mean by spontaneous order notion of law? It's basically this idea where they talk about discovering the law. Hayek talks about it in terms of vindicating the legitimate expectations of people living in a society. That you have a certain background understanding of what legal norms are and legal practices, and judges are essentially trying to discover that, right? They're trying to discover those norms. So just as it looks like if you're walking into a grocery store and you see the employee in the produce department changing the price of a pound of apples, nobody thinks that the grocery store clerk is making the price of apples, right? Yes, he's articulating apples are now going to be $1.19 a pound rather than, and they used to be 99 cents a pound, but nobody thinks that the grocery store clerk is actually creating the price of apples, right? And so what Leoni and Hayek are trying to say is that's the proper role of a judge, is that they'll reflect, and when the grocery store clerk is simply articulating whatever the market is bubbling up in terms of what the supply and demand dynamics of apples are at any given time. Also, it looks like he's setting the price, looks like he's making the price, but he's actually just articulating what millions of different consumers buying apples, oranges, grapes, and everything else are doing in terms of their choices, supply and demand, and the like. And he says that's what judges traditionally used to do under the common law and should be doing in terms of law. So that's the background to where this comes from, a certain understanding of the common law that reflects judges basically trying to channel expectations of society. Where that leads to is something very dramatic and something very radical in some sense. So I want to take, briefly as my text, a quote that Leoni has from Freedom and the Law. And Leoni says, "My earnest suggestion is that those who value individual freedom should reassess the place of the individual within the legal system as a whole. It is no longer a question of defending this or that particular freedom, to trade, to speak, to associate with other people, etc., nor is it a question of deciding what special good kind of legislation we adopt instead of a bad one." He says, "It is a question of deciding whether individual freedom is compatible in principle with the present system centered on and almost completely identified with legislation. This may seem like a radical view. I do not deny that it is. But radical views are sometimes more fruitful than synchronistic theories that serve to conceal the problems more than to solve them." Right? So at the heart of Leoni's argument is the notion that the free society is fundamentally incompatible with a system centered on legislation, and I would argue, he suggests administration as well, right? And so on one hand, what we have is this notion of the common law, which is grounded in the expectations and the norms and the interactions of voluntary individuals acting in society, and judges basically doing that. An important part of that, Leoni points out, is that the common law is fundamentally reactive. That the law doesn't get involved unless some person feels like they've been aggrieved and that they request that the law come in right their wrong. Right? The fundamental difference with legislation is that it is proactive. Right? Legislation purports to solve problems before they're ever going to arise, as does administration. The other fundamental characteristic of legislation is that its fundamental purpose is to make people do things they don't want to do. Right? So, compare a contract between an employer and an employee with the minimum wage law. Right? The only reason we have a minimum wage law is because I don't like the fact that you two want to enter into an employment contract. Right? You two are perfectly happy to enter an employment contract. I don't like it for some reason, and so I want to ban it. Right? And the point here is that legislative commands are binding, whether they are sensible, whether I know what I'm doing, whether I care what happens to you guys. Legislative commands are simply whatever a majority votes for. And legislative commands are, by design, made to make people do what they would not otherwise do. Right? As John Hasness said in our session earlier today, common law, we get laws, we get legislation when the common law doesn't produce the result that you want. Right? If the common law doesn't produce something, legislation produces it. And Leoni points out that legislation does it through the process of majorities basically defining things for minorities. So he says, in this way, legislation has undergone a very peculiar development. It's come to resemble more and more a sort of diktat that the winning majorities in a legislative assembly impose upon their minorities, often with the result of overturning long-established individual expectations and creating completely unprecedented ones. The succeeding minorities, in their turn, adjust themselves to their defeat only because they hope to become sooner or later a winning majority and to be in the position of treating in a similar way the people belonging to the contingent majority today. Right? So contrast those two views. One is their view of the common law, which is consensus building, which is basically people invoking the law only when they actually come into conflict, versus legislation, which is basically made by majorities reaching out and basically forcing people to do things that they don't otherwise want to do. Right? The second aspect of this, then, is this point about certainty, which is the argument for legislation is that the common law is too fuzzy. This idea of the common law as being discovered is too fuzzy, too unpredictable, and so what we need to have is perfect certainty by defining what the law would be. Right? Now, again, going back to the concept of the common law, what is the argument that they make for why the common law, what Leoni makes for why it's more certain? The logic that they have of the common law, which prevailed for about, I don't know, a millennium up until the 19th century, was that the common law was a set of concepts. The cases themselves are not the law. There's a series of concepts that underlie the common law. The cases evidence the concepts. They're like the characters. The common law is the plot, and the cases are the characters that advance the plot, that advance the story. Right? Their argument is that the concepts are relatively stable over time, even if the case outcomes vary a little bit from case to case to case. And that as long as those concepts over time are congruent with people's intuitions, it provides a long-run and more sensible way of people planning their affairs. Contrast that with legislation. Legislation can be very specific, but there's a problem with legislation. Number one, legislation requires an extreme degree of verbal formulation. And the criticism would be concepts, people can grasp concepts in our brains better than we can precisely articulate those concepts in words. So that the words of a particular judicial opinion are not, in fact, the common law. The words, the verbal articulations that we spend so much time parsing in our classes are not actually the common law. They're efforts to articulate the common law. The second, he says, is that the certainty of the law looks certain, but it can change radically. Common law, to the extent it changes, judge-made law, to the extent it changes very gradually over time. It changes as people's expectations change, right? We have no idea whether this time next year we'll have a radically different healthcare system in the United States or financial regulatory system in the United States, right? We could just wake up one day and everything we've been living with has been completely transformed, just as the passage of the Affordable Care Act radically transformed everything that we have now. Can people plan their affairs under that, in that world, in a world in which legislation could change so dramatically? Now take it to its logical extreme. Think about the administrative state. Think about what President Obama said about the unwillingness of Congress to change the law in the way he wanted. I have a pen and a phone, right? I have a pen and a phone, like that. I can make or unmake fortunes, like that. I can destroy entire industries, or decide to let them live. That's basically what the administrative state stands for today, right? Regulation by blog posts, right? Somebody actually said to me the other day, could you imagine that we're in a world now in which regulation is, pronouncements are made by Twitter, right? I was like, yeah, it's so different from a couple of years ago when they were made by blog posts instead, right? Right? Just willy-nilly waiving enforcement of laws and the like, right? And I think that frames up the question, right? I think that it is a radical question. Is liberty, freedom over the long run compatible with a world in which laws can be made by Twitter and blog posts, in which the laws can be different a year, 2, 5 years from now, radically different from what they are today? Can people survive in that world and maintain a system of freedom in the rule of law? I think by raising the question, I think Leoni to some extent answers the question, and I think it makes us like, the fish who swims in the water, right? We've kind of gotten used to it, and the question is whether or not that's sustainable over the long run. Leoni implies no, right? He doesn't answer the question necessarily, but he sort of answers the question, and it's pretty clear what he thinks about that. So, with that radical question that Leoni presents to us, and I leave with you, I will yield the podium.
This is exactly why we picked as a subject Leoni and the administrators, because nature of legal certainty, which is, basically at the root of our understanding of what the rule of law is or is not, is the weapon that Leoni uses to criticize over-legislation or over-regulation in his own time. But this raises many questions about the relevance of Leoni critiques for us, and I hope we'll get into that later on. Mario Rizzo.
First of all, lodged 2 complaints against the chair.
Speak up.
First, lodged 2 complaints against the chair. The first complaint is the first complaint is because he said he's the only Italian in the now you may be an Italian citizen, and I'm not, but you're not the only Italian. One. Number 2 is that now I lodged complaint against the chair and Todd because I made some notes about what I was going to say, and they, one by one, made all the points practically that I had written down. Todd talked for a long time, so he made lots of points. So I'm going to say just a few things, okay? Yeah, right. The first thing, I want to perhaps re-emphasize the fact that Leoni's conception of how laws should be, quote-unquote, produced is heavily influenced by Austrian economics. I mean, I think that's pretty clear. And it's especially influenced by the aspect of Austrian economics that we sometimes call the knowledge problem. Hayek made a point, especially in his 1945 article, but then after that as well, about how the market was a system in which decentralized knowledge could be mobilized for social purposes, and the importance of the particular circumstances of time and place in producing market prices, people's reactions or using their knowledge of the particular circumstances of time and place in producing ultimately market prices that we might today call efficient market prices. So Leoni thinks of laws being produced in particular circumstances, in particular context, with a plaintiff and a defendant, and particularly and sensitive, therefore, to special circumstances in a particular context. He actually quotes a number of Roman law sources. I think he quotes Cicero, who was reporting what Cato, I guess Cato the Elder, was saying about the Roman law, which very much captures the knowledge issue, right? The idea that over a long period of time, adjusting to particular circumstances, methods of solving problems developed out of experience, not out of grand theories. And that's a theme which Hayek pursues as well, that experience, in a sense, in particular circumstances, produces the adaptation rather than a priori theories about how the world should work and how problems should be solved. Now, decentralization of law is also, I think, important in another sense that's analogous to competition and the market. The idea of the error correction mechanism. Popper made this idea, emphasized this idea in the development of science, scientific theories as he saw it. Conjectures and refutations, and errors are corrected, and science moves on in that sense. Hayek adapted, I think, that idea, or adopted that idea and into his competition theory, and the thought of competition not only as a discovery process, but as an error correction process, that mistakes, when the mistakes are made, the discovery process discovers those mistakes and corrects them. So in the same way, I think we can look at decentralized law as a kind of error correction process that, unlike centralized statutory or legislative made law, we kind of make, in a sense, a ruling in a particular case. We see how it works out. The next case comes along. Was the previous decision satisfactory or not? Is it adapted to these particular circumstances? Mistakes in perhaps over-interpreting a previous decision can be remedied in a new decision. So there's a certain flexibility in a decentralized lawmaking system to correct previous errors. And one of the important aspects of that, which Leoni doesn't, I believe, get into, is the changing idea of precedent, which Todd went into, namely not viewing previous decisions as definitive statements of the law, but viewing them as evidence of what the common understandings are that the law is trying to give voice to. And so if precedent is only in some sense weakly binding, we always have the option, the ability to adapt to new circumstances. The second point I want to make has to do with the administrative state. The administrative state is not just a product of legislation in the sense of Parliament or Congress passing laws, but the administrative state is one removed from that, because after a certain mandate, currently a general mandate, is approved by Congress and an agency is established, there's an awful lot of rulemaking that never goes back to Congress for any kind of approval. Congress has oversight, but it doesn't necessarily amount to much in most cases. And so there is a level at which the traditional notions of democracy are completely obliterated by the administrative state, because now even the legislature doesn't know what's happening, necessarily know what's happening, hasn't given its approval to what's happening, and the nature of the original mandate in creating the agency that can dramatically change without there being any reassessment by the legislature. This idea was foreshadowed really in the discussions about central economic planning. In fact, back into the 1920s, with both Harold Lasky and before that the Webbs, saying that in fact the notion of democracy would have to change to make comprehensive economic planning possible, because experts would have to be in charge and they could not be submitting their expert decisions to the parliament, because the parliament is not comprised of people who know much about what should be done in terms of economic planning, or we would say today in terms of economic regulation. So I think that the two things that one can get out of Leoni's work is first the importance of decentralized lawmaking, and then the threat that that legislation in the form of the administrative state as we understand it today is not only to the rule of law, but also to our conception of democracy.
The chairman wants to apologize to President Rizzo for the impression of Italianness, but I shall confess I got a very weak notion of identity. So for me, an Italian is somebody who pays taxes in Italy, which is in itself a very enviable condition. Let me tell you that.
Socially constructed.
Yes.
I wanted to know, actually, I did pay taxes in Italy. I got some kind of honorarium, and they took out.
You do it once in a while.
All right.
It's
Unless you want to make a confession that you're not really Italian.
All right. Okay.
Well, I want to reinforce his point on Austrian economics by pointing out one little dirty secret about Leoni. There was Leoni when he was very young, namely when he was in high school, he was a Marxist. Now, sometimes I believe I'm the only Italian who was not a Marxist while in high school. It was a very common disease. And Leoni got it over at a certain point, but it's fairly interesting. The reason why he got over his Marxism before bumping into Mises and Hayek and Austrian economics. Leoni said that the main reason why he didn't like Marx was the fact that he thought that in Das Kapital what was lacking, I quote, is chiefly the experience of the real economic world, which is not made of atoms, crystals, or cellular tissues, or other such matters and Marxian metaphors, but instead of assessments, judgments, and never-ending choices of concrete individuals. So Leoni was coming to these basically in the early 1930s, so well before he got any Austrian economics. He had an exam at university with Luigi Einaudi, a great Italian classical liberal economist, a friend of Ludwig von Mises, but clearly at that time Leoni's economics was very small. So it's interesting that he got this instinctive need for something like the Austrian school. I would like now to give the floor to Chris DeMuth, and I'm personally very interested to listen to Chris's comment because he is such a perceptive and critic of the administrative state for what it is now, and so very curious to hear what he found of value in Leoni.
Speaking here at Scalia Law School about Leoni sitting between Mingardi and Rizzo. I'm thinking that maybe when the school was renamed, there was a secret codicil that the school would begin promoting Italian political thought. This is the first initiative. There's a saying among diplomats and academics at the long conferences. We've been talking about these matters since 9 o'clock this morning. Late in the day, somebody will say, well, everything that there is to be said has been said, but not everybody has said it. And I'm a bit in that position, but there are a few points that I would like to make elaborating on what Todd and Mario have said. First of all, I want to recommend to students of law, as immersed as you are in studying cases and statutes and current issues in the law, to go back and read the classics of classical liberal thought about the development of the legal institutions that we live with today is immensely valuable and eye-opening. To see what the greatest thinkers have thought decades before the emergence of the world that we are in, using very different forms of argumentation that we do today. You start reading this book and it is fairly abstract, pays a lot of attention to categories, to the internal logic of a situation. There's very little talk about consequences of this institution versus that, and to see how far a thinker of Leoni's talent could take them is very, very interesting, and to see how much they foresaw before it occurred, and some of the things that they missed is extremely stimulating. So I got a great education out of reading these works and discussing them today. I want to put a little bit of a different twist on some of the things that have been said. Many people, including many people who are law students, when they think of the law, they think of something that is handed down from on high. It's a sentence or a command written in a book somewhere, or a pronouncement of some important agency of government. Even before we had tens of thousands of pages of federal statutes and hundreds of thousands of pages of federal regulations, there was a view that law that was something on high, that there were these norms that society had created a certain set of moral obligations and constraints and duties, and that you had to master what these are, and these were high abstractions, and we little people, we lived within this large edifice of the law. The most important part of Leoni's radicalism is that he turns that completely upside down. And he says, no, law comes from us little people. It comes from individuals and their actions in society. From Alberto's quote about wanting to anchor things in the choices of concrete individuals, Leoni derives a really amazing metaphor from the idea of the economic system or market to the idea of the legal system. He wants to show us that law in the form of the traditional common law, much of it decided by judges, but much of it decided simply by lawyers or rabbis or priests, learned people who could tell you what you could expect if you had a conflict with your neighbor, that this form of law could take the form of large abstract principles. It looked like it was something being handed down, but that's just like in the marketplace. You see prices and you see institutions and you see automobiles or iPhones being offered for sale with these devices and that, but nobody handed that down. These are the result of a continuous stream of decisions by actual people, and we're seeing the construct. Similarly to Leoni, the law, when we talk about the rules of liability or of contract law or of property, we're simply describing what we think is the current state of play in an endless, not endless, but a very, very long stream of individual controversies. He calls them claims. In a marketplace, we have supply and demand. In the constitution of the law, we have people that have claims. The claims can arise because two people have a contract and one is dissatisfied with how the other is behaving. He thinks he has to be compensated, or he thinks the terms of the contract have to be changed. Well, how are we going to settle that? You consult with people who know how such disputes have been settled in the past and try to give you a sense of how it would come out if it came before a judge. And if you and the other party have about the same view of how that would come out, you have essentially a voluntary transaction, just like in a marketplace. Or if somebody has been trespassing across your property but claims to have something called an easement. Well, there have been thousands and thousands you're not the first people to claim that this person can't come on your property. This has been done before. So when we talk about the law, it is actually the manifestation, just as in markets, of thousands and thousands of concrete instances of human action and interaction, and how people have tried to settle their differences. And people look at the specifics and they weigh the arguments on both sides, and they come up with a rule that seems to reflect customs and habits and how they are practiced. He pushes the market analogy much further even than Hayek does. And we sat around today and we talked about many points where it seemed to us that he'd gotten things a little bit right or a little bit wrong. But that is a result of the audacious ambition of this work. Another word about the idea of certainty. Most people believe that one of the irreducible attributes of living under the rule of law is certainty. We have to know what the law is so we can conform our conduct to the law. And this had the effect, this was used by a lot of people who wanted to say the law is something that's handed down on high and we have to conform to it rather than we're the creators of it. To say that as long as the law is clear, stated in terms of general propositions, then we all know about it, then we are living under the rule of law because we have a good sense of certainty about what the laws are. Leoni's having nothing to do with that. He's saying that law, as in our conversation today, I used the analogy, I haven't bought or sold a home for 30 years. I don't know what's happening in real estate markets. I'm not certain about it. I don't know anything about it. If I suddenly had to sell my home, I would find myself a broker or an expert, or I would study the market. And I would learn enough about it so that I could guide my behavior. I don't have to be certain about the real estate market. Similarly, in the law, you get into a dispute or a disagreement, or you're trying to conduct your affairs in some new area that you don't know about. The law doesn't have to be written down anywhere. I don't have to be certain about it. All I have to do is to be able to consult somebody, a legal broker called a personal lawyer, that knows enough about this area so that I can become informed enough to plan my affairs, to engage in the transactions that will be good for me and good for the people around me. So the fact that that the law is not kind of written down, it's not just something you can look up and know, here's the law here, and it can be implicit in people's habits and customs, is perfectly fine, especially since if it arises from the conduct of people like us, and I kind of know what other people are like, I could probably guess about what it would be like before consulting a specialist. What he does not like is the kind of uncertainty that arises dynamically from the fact that the law can be changed frequently and quickly. And one of the things he detests about legislation is suddenly you can have large and dramatic changes because a legislature will pass a law that will completely occupy some domain. This isn't the kind of marginal, incremental decision-making that is raised from actually looking at a dispute between a trespasser and a property owner and listening to their arguments. This is making a law of trespass just a bunch of legislators sitting around. He comes before the time when we're thinking about special interests captivating the legislature. He just thinks if they're going to write something that's supposed to be clear for a very broad area of society, they cannot possibly have the information to do it right. But they have the power to change things frequently, and it is that form of dynamic uncertainty that is the enemy of freedom. My own interest in my own work is with the growth of the administrative state and government regulation, de facto lawmaking by regulatory and other administrative agencies under warrant of often very broad instructions issued by elective legislatures. Todd Zywicki said that he thought that this was a natural outgrowth of legislation. It's kind of, as he said, legislation on steroids. And Leoni, I think, in his writing, sees that you can see how lots and lots of laws are actually being made by bureaucracies with very, very wide discretion. And he just he sees that just as an extension of legislation. To him, the important change, the important move in the nature of our law was when legislatures, governed by majority rule, went beyond simply making the kinds of organizational decisions for the government that only the government can make, such as taxes to raise an army, right? It moved beyond those kinds of decisions to actually ordering the affairs within society. That was when we had majority rule, the ability to make flat, broad, definite laws rather than incremental bottom-up laws. That was the big change for him. I disagree with that, and I see things a little bit more the way Mario did, that the emergence of the administrative state has been another fundamental change in the nature of our law. For one thing, bureaucratic law is not majoritarian. Leoni is very impressed by the coercive aspect that majoritarian law is overruling the preferences and desires of some substantial minority in almost all cases. But many, I would say most of the things that, well, I won't go that far. A good number of things that are done by the bureaucracies are done by highly specialized agencies. They have been given the assignment to regulate relations between men and women on campus, or air pollution, or drugs, or racial discrimination in the workplace, by legislators overwhelmed by the demands that the modern world places on them to make more and more decisions about more and more aspects of life, which, although majoritarian, at least in our system in America, is still extremely cumbersome and slow-moving. They couldn't possibly decide all of the things that well-organized groups want them to decide. So they just set up an agency and say, you deal with that one. You figure out what discrimination against the handicapped means. You lay down the rules for that one. So everything takes place in these specialized agencies. Much of what the agencies do over time becomes is siloed decision-making. It is made by a small group of people. Sometimes they the Sierra Club and ExxonMobil will disagree heatedly over what the EPA should do, but they belong to this little universe. They don't have the generalist perspective that the legislature does. And as a result, we find many, many things coming out of the regulatory agencies that could not come close to surviving a majority vote in the House and the Senate. So it strikes me as being a different species of law. It is vulnerable to criticisms on grounds of infringement of liberty, corruption, abuse of power, simply bad policies that do not comport with what people would do exercising their own reason in individual circumstances. But it is as different from legislative decision making as legislative decision making is from decentralized law that Leoni describes. In many cases, I think if Leoni were here today, he would say that although it is different, its threats to the rule of law are very, very similar. For example, he placed a great emphasis on the importance of certainties in arranging our private affairs of one kind or another. He had this particular view of certainty that was based very substantially on stability, the stability of spontaneous bottom-up decision-making. One of the big things that we see in the modern bureaucratic state is that the stock of laws, that is, commands that have to be obeyed, and the velocity of change is far, far greater than anything that we saw in the day when law came to be dominated by legislatures rather than common law courts. So the problem of certainty and the extent that in itself, that the loss of certainty, that the loss of stability of law weakens not just the rule of law, but the human liberty, freedom upon which it depends, has become greatly accentuated by this next level of law that we're dealing with.
Before moving up to our reception, I think we'd love to get some questions, comments from the audience, from other conference participants of today, and then perhaps the joiner who told me he wanted to add something back into his. Nigel.
Yeah, Nigel Ashford, Institute for Humane Studies. This is in response to Todd, who emphasized correctly, I think, the common law theme in Bruno Leoni. But of course, common law is a very Anglo-American approach. It is not a continental European approach. So I see as part of what Bruno Leoni was trying to do was to try and influence continental European law to be more Anglo-American in nature. And I don't think that was very successful. Indeed, my question is going to be, to what extent is the growth of administrative law in the United States a reflection that we've been importing ideas of continental European law into our system?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we've all been using it as a shorthand. We talk about common law because that's how we think of it over here, right? Leoni's book actually holds up Roman law and the evolution of Roman law as his example, and the precise distinction he draws is between common law, which is judge-made law, where he claims that Roman law was actually lawyer-made law, and these jurisconsults and these sorts of things that, all these sorts of things. And so he claims that's what the Roman law really was, and then later Roman law gets codified and distorted a bit by the Code of Justinian and things like that. So it's not, and then he sort of says, and the common law is like this also, right? Hayek makes many of the same points basically in the context of the common law. So I think we're all kind of using this as a shorthand. Right, but what I think he is trying to say is that would be consistent with your argument is rhetorically, and I'd be interested in Alberto's thoughts on this, is rhetorically, right, the continental legal systems tend to trace their roots back to Roman law, And what Leoni is really trying to do is say Roman law was really about spontaneous order law and not the Code of Justinian, which is everybody thinks is the genius is Roman law. Would that be accurate, do you think, Alberto?
I think it would be. So the Roman law part was key in the Italian discussion for Leoni. That's for sure. At the very same time, it is unquestionable that Leoni was an unrepentant Anglophile, and that comes up very clearly throughout his work. I think one key point is that somehow, well, perhaps, generalizing about continental Europe is a bit like, Hayek, Anglo-Saxon and continental European individualism, which is always puzzling to me, because Anglo-Saxon individualism includes people with the name like Bastia.
Yeah.
And continental individualism is about guys like Bentham and John Stuart Mill. So it's maybe good history of thought, but it's very bad geography. But in a way, I think what Leoni saw in his own country was an anticipation of future development, also over here up to a certain extent. Let me make a point as the Italian who pays taxes in Italy on the pound. The Italians have one thing everybody envies, which is creativity. Food, ties, this sort of stuff. And creativity in the marketplace is a great plus. Creativity in the parliament, not so much. I can remember at least 4 different instances in the last 20 years when the parliament assembled commissions to get together and just come out. Not so much with a, it's a very Napoleonic pro-legislation idea, not so much with a single understanding of Italian law, but just with an understanding of how many laws we do have in Italy. All the 4 times the commission gathered together, tried, it asked for documents, it got together again, and then commissioner respectfully resigned and announced their salary as commissioners. So this is, I got a couple of friends who were members of parliaments, and they used to tell me something that perhaps points into a different understanding of the wisdom of legislature than the one it was alluded before by Mario and Chris. They told me, we, as legislators, we voted plenty of times for stuff we did not understand, we did not quite understand. But when we realized that all of us were voting in favor of a given measure, one thing we knew, it was going to be bad for the Italian taxpayer. This, I think Leoni saw that developing in the 50s, and in a way that's very impressive, because to people of my generation, the 50s in Italy are kind of a mythical era of limited government. And Leoni saw that, instead we planted the seeds for not so limited government at the time. I don't know if you want to...
And I'll just add to your second point. Well, first a footnote to that, which is just in addition to my public choice book. It turns out nobody knows how many agencies there are in the. There is no accurate, 100% accurate count of how many agencies there are in the federal government. Yeah, the number of different agencies. They range. Estimates are from about, I think, 270 to about 410, depending on how you define an agency. A department, a sub-department, offices within a department of the government, all these different sorts of things. So, but to your point on the administrative law, I think that's a very interesting point, right? Which is obviously Wilson incorporated the idea of the administrative state from Germany and basically said, "Oh, you people in America, you're so wimpy. Don't you understand? We can have the efficiency of the Germans without all the bad stuff we don't like about the Germans, right?" But there's an interesting point there, right? Which is one of the interesting things about that is that the conversation over the rule of law, to some extent, gets, I think, waylaid in the Anglo-American tradition when they start talking about it by Dicey, who was particularly concerned about articulating the rule of law in the context of the administrative state, right, and restraints on the administrative state. Hayek then picks that up in his definition that associates the rule of law with the Rechtsstaat, which comes out of Dicey, right, and it's seen as a taming of the administrative state. What Leoni and that Hayek are saying in law, legislation, and liberty, and I think Oakeshott, when he's writing about the rule of law, are saying it's much more radical, right, which is they're basically saying the rule of law is not just something about the administrative state. It's something about how we order our affairs within society more generally and how law is made, right? And so I think in that sense, the association with the administrative state and the notion of the rule of law is arising out of early efforts by Dicey to tame the administrative state as that gets articulated. I suspect probably has had an influence on how we conceive of law in the rule of law. I mean, Chris might have thoughts on this.
I have a lot of thoughts on this, but why don't we get more questions?
Well, I just want to add a valuable historical point here about the problem with parliaments. About 100 years ago, the General Assembly of Indiana proposed a law, fortunately it was not passed, to round the value of pi to 3. And this says that maybe expertise has a use. It's an actual fact. It actually happened about 110 years ago.
Got Michelle.
Michelle Boardman, professor here at Scalia Law. What does Leoni's work tell us about the fact that the law, the underlying law that judges are supposed to be discovering is influenced by the judge-discovered or common law as it already exists? So, what someone believes is their right or what they think are the damages they might be allowed to have in court, and their expectations about what it is they should be awarded if there's a claim against another person, those things are heavily influenced by what the rules were when you grew up, right, in that society. So, which is part of the whole point of having continuity, right? So there aren't these sudden shifts. So what do we do about the fact that there's this very strong feedback loop? And how are judges to discover this underlying thing that the whole structure itself is already strongly shaped?
I would say two things. Part of Leoni's Anglophilia is that he sort of liked the chaotic, informal structure of the British common law system, where you could do a lot of forum shopping. You could kind of go to one group, you didn't like that, you could go to another, and you could kind of work this out with your advisor. On the questions you raise about possible biases among judges, or the fact that they're kind of caught up in an older system, there was a lot of discussion about that today, and I think that Leoni himself does not adequately address the problems of customs and habits in the population that are in some way bad, dysfunctional, or becoming anti-Semitism, discrimination against women, discrimination against racial minorities during a time of change. And you have judges holding on to the old customs. How do we change that? Hayek allows for a little bit of an escape valve with a certain amount of interpretation, where he allows for the possibility of corrective legislation. Think the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that sort of thing. We had a lot of debates about that, but I would say that the answer to your question, you can't find it in Leoni, but I think you can find it in a lot of contemporary scholarship about the dynamic efficiency properties of the common law. Professor Zywicki has made a good contribution to that. There is an important piece that Andre Schleifer and a fellow at where is he from? What school? In Milan. And anyway, there's a modern piece that shows that even if you have some sorts of biases, which you can describe one way or the other among judges, if you have a long succession of people bringing complaints where two parties disagree about what the law is, by definition they have to disagree somewhat or it wouldn't be in litigation, that a long succession of those, even if you've got very, very differing views among different judges as to what the proper law is, conduces over time in a direction of more efficient, which we can, I think, say is simply more socially satisfactory law. So I think that a lot of contemporary law and economic scholars paid a lot of attention to that, but I think it's subsequent to the kind of arguments that Leoni was making.
I think forum shopping is implied by Leoni's thing, that litigants have an ex ante opportunity to choose their court. To put it another way, I think an implication of this thing is that Erie is probably wrongly decided, and Smith versus Tyson is correctly decided.
We shall thank Professor Rizzo, who needs to go and catch a train. Thank you. On the point, I think one reason for which Leoni is fascinated by the common law, all of this taking into account, is nonetheless obviously the fact that he flirts with an idea of some sort of an hermeneutic reading of the law. That is clearly there in Leoni. And of course, in Leoni's word, so to say, the area of application of coercion and the law is so limited that clearly the amount of damage even prejudices could do is quite limited by that version. But it's clearly a tension and a problem with these.
Alberto, tell a few more stories from home.
That's great.
The Italian court system is legendary for being unworkable, totally hopeless, you don't get anywhere. Was that not so when I understand that so the common law, the way he talks about it and thinks about it, is not identical with whatever judges do. That said, you have to have some confidence in the tribunals that are actually out there, right? To put any kind of hope in this kind of model. Did the courts work better then, or do we just have the wrong impression of the Italian court system now? Just have a few bars, tell a few stories.
I'm going by guessing on that. I'm going to be not particularly PC on the matter. One of the main problems with the Italian judiciary now is the extent to which it is ideologically homogeneous. The Italian judiciary, not unlikely the Italian press, not unlikely a good chunk of Italian academia until very recently, is basically the successful output of an hegemony attempt. It's Gramscianism in action. And that was one of the biggest problems we've seen in recent years. I mean, if you have a labor case, for example, you know from the outset what is going to be the verdict. And there were some very egregious cases of people that were caught stealing, not going to work, shot by camera, and that didn't matter at all. In Leoni's time, that hegemonic process was just starting. So Leoni died in 1967. Got a problem with the structure of legislation that was fairly similar. Leoni dies 19 years after the Italian Constitution passes. And before 1948, of course, Italy may have been an egregious case of failure of constitutionalism, because you could have fascism with a classical liberal constitution. But the Italian statutes of 1848 is by and large a cliche of a classical liberal constitution. So I think there are reasons why Leoni may have been slightly more positive about the Italian judiciary at the time than, you know, your average Italian friend is about the Italian judiciary today. But I don't know if Daniele perhaps wants to add something.
Oh, it's fine.
Can I say one last word, Alberto? I just wanted to do 2 points. First, I wanted to clarify and associate myself with Chris's points. When I clarified, I said the administrative state is legislation on steroids. I meant in a Leonian type system, not that it's not majoritarian, but that all the problems of uncertainty, complexity, unpredictability are even greater in terms of the administrative state and the way in which you have change in that. I think a second thing that we glossed over that I think is interesting that point Leoni makes is one of the big differences between common law or judge-made law and legislative law is it's not only legislative law changes frequently, it's also that it can change with no reason, right? When you make a judicial decision, you understand the reason. There's a logic behind it. You may not agree with the logic, right? Legislation makes no pretense of having any logic, right? It can be a random number generator. It's just passed, and it doesn't have to make any sense. It doesn't have to be justified in any sort of way. It may just be an interest group bargain. It may just be something a particular politician likes. Which he says increases the uncertainty and the unpredictability, right? It may be solving a problem. It may be addressing something that's not even a problem. It might be creating new problems, right? And that adds to the uncertainty that's pure majoritarian might and not any sort of logic.
In fact, you could go beyond that and say that legislation typically cannot be rationalized by its very nature, in that it reflects compromise. Legislation consists of unprincipled compromises. I've got my views, I've got strong principles, you've got your views, and so we kind of come halfway between it. Neither of us is really happy with it. You couldn't rationalize it in any particular way. So
yeah, there's no reason to change it. There's really no reason to pick something new, right? It just kind of falls.
And we don't have to explain ourselves. We got elected by the voters, and that's all that makes any difference. I mean, judges have to explain themselves truthfully or evasively, but they've got to. Regulatory agencies have to have NPRMs. They've got to explain themselves. Legislators do not. They may, but they do not have to.
This note, I want to thank once again the law school, the Antonin Scalia Law School, for its wonderful hospitality, Liberty Fund for its support in organizing these conferences, our wonderful panelists for their insights, and I think we have a reception waiting for us. And of course, thank you so much for attending and taking the time of spending an hour and a half with us. Thank you so much.